If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. This week and every week on Biblical Anarchy, we seek to live counterculture to the empire of man and to instead seek the kingdom of God by unpacking what the Bible teaches about government, authority, and human relationships. I'm your host, Jacob Winograd. Today, I'm excited to dive into a fascinating conversation I recently had with Kasimir, an experienced AnCap debater who studied the work of contemporary libertarian jurists. We explored the nuanced and often contentious relationship between moral action and legal action, and how self-ownership is demonstrated through the biblical commandments against murder, theft, and idolatry. Before we jump in, I'd like to remind you to subscribe, like, and share this podcast if you enjoy our discussions. Your support helps us reach more people and spread the message of biblical anarchy and libertarian principles. All right, let's get started. My recent live stream with Kasimir was a deep dive into libertarian legal theory, a subject that can often seem complex and abstract. Kasimir, who identifies as an objective law AnCap, brought a wealth of knowledge to the table. We started by discussing the distinctions between what is moral and what is legal within a libertarian framework. Kasimir has a background in debating on platforms like The Crucible and engaging with various ideological opponents, from nationalists to right-wing populists. He's read from and conversed with a lot of libertarian jurists, such as Stefan Kinsella. This background gave him a unique perspective on the importance of having clear, objective principles when discussing libertarianism. During our talk, Kasimir emphasized the need to separate moral discussions from legal ones. He argued that libertarianism should focus primarily on the latter, defining and adhering to objective laws that prevent the initiation of conflict and aggression. This was a crucial point of our discussion, and one that I believe is essential for anyone trying to understand or advocate for libertarian principles. While I agree libertarianism is a legal theory, I often postulate it as an extension of Christian ethics and morality. One of the core themes we explored was the overlap between moral and legal actions. As Christians and libertarians, we often find ourselves navigating the delicate balance between our moral convictions and the legal framework we advocate for. In our conversation, we referenced a chart shared from a mutual friend, Monarcho Hopian, on X. This chart effectively illustrates the intersection of these two realms, providing a visual framework to understand their relationship. So let me describe the chart for the audio-only listeners. I'll also have the chart on the episode website page and in the video thumbnail. The chart depicts the relationship between all human actions, distinguishing them into categories of legal and illegal actions, with a subset of legal actions that are also moral. So let me explain these different categories. First, all human actions. The chart starts with the broad category of all human actions, encompassing everything individuals might do. Second, legal actions. Within this broad category, there is a subset of actions deemed legal by the standards of libertarian legal theory. These actions do not initiate aggression or violate the non-aggression principle, NAP. Also, although not shown in the chart itself, implied there are also then illegal actions. Actions that fall outside the realm of legality are considered illegal, primarily because they involve initiating aggression or violating the NAP. Finally, moral actions. Among the legal actions, there is a further subset of actions that are also considered moral. These actions not only comply with legal standards, but also align with ethical and moral principles. What is important here is the overlap between legal and moral actions. The overlap between legal and moral actions signifies that many actions deemed legal within a libertarian framework also align with moral principles. For example, not stealing or not committing murder are both legal requirements and moral imperatives. This intersection highlights the inherent connection between respecting legal boundaries and upholding moral values. Legal actions, when grounded in the NAP and self-ownership, often reflect core moral principles such as respect for others' lives and property. Legal actions that protect self-ownership, such as prohibitions against murder and theft, are inherently moral because they uphold the individual's autonomy and rights. Now, can we demonstrate self-ownership? Kasimir explained how self-ownership is a fundamental concept that underpins both legal and moral actions. The recognition of self-ownership means acknowledging each individual's right to their own body and property. Libertarian legal theory is consistent, but it is grounded on the concept of self-ownership. That has come under criticism from conservatives such as Andrew Wilson, whom Dave Smith, Kasimir, and myself have debated. It can be tempting in these debates to say the concept is a social construction, but Kasimir argues self-ownership is not just a social construct, but an objective reality that can be demonstrated through argumentation ethics and the consistent application of non-aggression principles, as well as through biblical principles. Argumentation ethics is an argument for the validity of self-ownership based on arguing how the act of engaging in a conversation or debate inherently acknowledges self-ownership. When we communicate, we recognize each other's autonomy and right to speak and be heard. This mutual recognition forms the basis of self-ownership and, by extension, the justification for property rights and the prohibition of aggression. We also touched on how self-ownership is reflected in biblical teachings. The commandments against murder and theft inherently recognize the individual's right to their life and property. By upholding these commandments, we are, in essence, affirming the principle of self-ownership. Here, then, is the demonstration of how these biblical commandments or principles are used to demonstrate self-ownership. First, murder. The commandment, "Thou shalt not murder," directly correlates with the libertarian prohibition against initiating violence. This commandment underscores the principle of self-ownership, that each person has the right to their own life and body. Any act of murder is a violation of this fundamental right. Second, theft. "Thou shalt not steal" is another clear parallel. In libertarian theory, property rights are paramount. Theft is seen as an aggression against someone's property, which they rightfully own. By advocating against theft, we uphold the principle that individuals have the right to their property without fear of it being taken without consent. Third, idolatry. This might seem less obvious, but "you shall have no other gods before me," and "thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image" can be seen as a call to recognize and respect the sovereignty of God, and by extension, the sovereignty of each individual's conscience, and the image of God each person is created in. Furthermore, idolatry in a political sense can be equated to the worship of the state or any human authority over the divine order, which libertarians resist by advocating for minimal state interference. The state claims a type of authority that the Christian should see as only properly belonging to God. Let's consider some practical implications of these conclusions. Understanding the overlap between legal and moral actions helps clarify how a libertarian legal framework can support a moral society. Legal rules based on the NAP and self-ownership not only prevent aggression, but also promote ethical behavior. This approach provides a consistent and objective foundation for both legal and moral judgments, reducing the potential for arbitrary or subjective interpretations of what is right and wrong. We then turned our attention to the actions that lie on the boundary between legal and moral considerations. These edge cases are where the nuances of libertarian theory are most apparent and challenging. Here are some examples of edge cases. The first category are actions that are legal but potentially immoral. These are actions that do not violate the non-aggression principle and are thus legal within a libertarian framework, but may be considered immoral based on various ethical standards. Examples include evicting a tenant into a snowstorm without prior agreement or consuming certain substances. The second category are actions that are moral but potentially illegal. These are actions that align with moral principles but may conflict with existing legal standards, especially under non-libertarian regimes. Examples include civil disobedience against unjust laws or rescuing someone in a life-threatening situation without their explicit consent. Now, let's explore legal but potentially immoral actions. For example, eviction in extreme conditions. Kasimir and I discussed scenarios such as evicting a tenant into a snowstorm. While legally permissible under property rights, this action could be seen as morally reprehensible due to the potential harm to the tenant. We agreed that, within a libertarian framework, while such an eviction might be legal, community norms and voluntary agreements could help mitigate such harsh outcomes. Covenant communities could establish rules that provide for more compassionate handling of such situations, balancing legal rights with moral considerations. Another example is the use of substances that are harmful to the individual but do not directly harm others. Legally, individuals have the right to their bodies and choices, but morally, it might be concerning due to the self-destructive nature of the behavior. Kasimir and I emphasized that while the state should not intervene, social and community support systems play a vital role in addressing these moral concerns. We also gave examples of moral but potentially illegal actions. We explored cases where individuals engage in civil disobedience against laws they perceive as unjust. Morally, such actions can be justified if they are aimed at correcting significant wrongs, but legally, they might result in penalties. Kasimir argued that libertarian legal theory would support such actions if they align with the NAP and self-ownership, even if they conflict with existing state laws. There is also the example, rescuing without consent. We discussed situations where someone might intervene to save another person's life without their explicit consent, such as preventing a suicide attempt. While this might be considered illegal under strict interpretations of self-ownership, morally, it could be justified. Kasimir highlighted that in such cases, the intention and context are crucial. If the person is not of sound mind, acting in their best interest might be morally and, in a nuanced legal interpretation, permissible. So, society and Christians must balance these legal and moral considerations. This led to a discussion on community standards and voluntary agreements. Both Kasimir and I emphasized the importance of community standards and voluntary agreements in navigating these edge cases. By establishing clear community norms and consensual agreements, individuals can create environments that respect both legal rights and moral values. There is also the dichotomy of objective versus subjective interpretations within the theory of private law. We touched on the need for objective legal standards to prevent arbitrary enforcement, while recognizing that moral considerations often require subjective interpretation. The challenge is to create a legal framework that is flexible enough to account for moral nuances without compromising on the core principles of non-aggression and self-ownership. This, however, is the strength of a polycentric market-based legal order, because competition and market forces work to improve these legal interpretations over time, as well as providing for flexible and varied means of enforcement and pursuing justice or resolution. This discussion highlighted the complexity of actions that lie on the boundary of legal and moral considerations. While libertarian legal theory provides a clear framework for determining legality based on non-aggression and self-ownership, moral judgments often require a more nuanced approach. By relying on community standards, voluntary agreements, and a balance of objective and subjective interpretations, it is possible to navigate these edge cases in a way that upholds both legal and moral principles. The state solves these issues through fiat, which, while seemingly might seem preferable due to its simplicity, an objective and empirical analysis shows this approach only leads to corruption and greater injustices. Ends not only fail to justify the means, but means often become ends. Pursuing justice or truth in ways that aren't logically or morally consistent will scarcely lead to logical or moral outcomes. Kasimir made an interesting point about the objective nature of law. He argued that while moral principles are essential, they must be grounded in objective legal frameworks to prevent the initiation of conflict. This means that our legal system should be based on clear, objective rules that everyone can understand and follow. For instance, in a libertarian society, laws would focus on preventing aggression and ensuring restitution for victims. This objective approach helps maintain social order and protects individual rights without imposing subjective moral judgments. When we pursue what is moral within the objective limits of the law, it can be argued this is actually the greatest pursuit of what is morally good and the greatest way to preserve and promote morality in society. The alternative is to have a legal framework that is flawed and to pursue what is moral in a way that is criminal, thus losing your moral and legal grounding. This relates to common objections and misconceptions about libertarianism that we discussed. One significant challenge is the accusation that libertarians are too permissive or lack moral guidance. This criticism often arises from misunderstandings about the distinction between moral and legal actions. Kasimir pointed out that while libertarianism doesn't prescribe specific moral behaviors, it provides a framework that allows individuals to live according to their moral convictions without infringing on others' rights. This means that in a libertarian society, people can form communities with shared moral values and enforce those values within their community as long as they don't initiate aggression against others. We also discussed how libertarians can address issues like immigration, public property, and social order. Kasimir proposed innovative solutions, such as the concept of guardianship over public property, which challenges the notion that public property is inherently abandoned. By claiming guardianship, individuals can take responsibility for maintaining and protecting public resources without resorting to state control. This approach highlights the flexibility and adaptability of libertarian principles. By focusing on voluntary cooperation and mutual respect for property rights, we can create a society that upholds both moral and legal standards without relying on coercive state power. As we wrapped up our conversation, Kasimir and I emphasized the importance of applying libertarian principles in practical, real-world scenarios. It's not enough to simply debate these ideas in theory. We must find ways to implement them in our daily lives and communities. One practical application we discussed was the idea of covenant communities. These are voluntary associations where individuals agree to live by a set of shared rules and values. By establishing clear boundaries and expectations, covenant communities can maintain social order and uphold moral standards without state intervention. Another key point was the importance of communication and education. To build a more libertarian society, we must engage in conversations, share ideas, and educate others about the principles of non-aggression, self-ownership, and voluntary cooperation. This grassroots approach can help shift public perception and build a broader base of support for libertarian ideas. Ultimately, our goal is to create a society where individuals are free to pursue their own happiness, live according to their moral convictions, and interact with others in a peaceful, voluntary manner. By staying true to our principles and finding innovative solutions to contemporary challenges, we can move closer to this ideal. But this is merely just the tip of the iceberg, and I plan on having a follow-up conversation with Kasimir to discuss the full complexities of trying to act on our principles and also pursuing realistic goals in society to not make the perfect the enemy of the good. Thank you all for joining me on this episode of the Biblical Anarchy podcast. I hope my discussion with Kasimir provided valuable insights into the overlap between moral action and legal action, and how self-ownership is demonstrated through biblical commandments. If you want to check out the full conversation, the link will be in the show notes. Remember, the principles of non-aggression, self-ownership, and voluntary cooperation are not just theoretical concepts. They are practical tools that we can use to build a more just, peaceful, and prosperous society. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might benefit from our conversation. Your support helps us continue to explore these important topics and reach a wider audience. Until next time, as I always say, live at peace and live for Christ. Take care, everyone.
The Biblical Anarchy podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.